Morning, church. You know, one of the things that I love to do is I love to come up here and honor, because the scriptures tell us to honor one another above ourselves, and that always keeps us in a humble state. But one of the things that I'm going to be doing today is I'm really excited because I'm going to honor someone today, and I think he's a brave young man, probably one of the bravest people we know. And I am just incredibly encouraged by this young man. So if you're willing, give me a few minutes just to really honor him, because I believe he's so courageous. You know, one of our members here is Andrew Ward. He goes through a lot of health issues, but he seems to have a good attitude, and he's so much stronger. And I hate hospitals, and I'm kind of a coward when it comes to pain, but he's so strong. And in fact, one of the things that really delighted him and his family was that he was awarded a Make-A-Wish Foundation wish. And so he wanted to show some of these. His family wanted us to display some of those. And I was excited to do so because Andrew is such an amazing young man. And so here are just some of the things that Andrew got to experience. He got his Make-A-Wish shirt. And Make-A-Wish made my wish come true. And one of the cool things is that he got to meet this character from Halo, one of his favorite video games. He actually got to meet him. That's really exciting and interesting. And that's so amazing. And here we're just seeing some pictures from his day. And then he got to go and be in that limousine. Isn't that just a wonderful experience? And he got to include his family in this. And it's just a beautiful sight to see that he got to enjoy so much of that. Gotta love that. And there they are, looking like rock stars. Andrew's a rock star. And here they gave him some video games, a TV, and things like that. And I'm just really proud of Andrew. And I want to just take a moment. So I'm going to ask Andrew and his family, if you're willing to stand up, we would like to honor you today. Andrew, if you can see me, I want to tell you I'm proud of you. And knowing what you go through and with the heart and attitude you have, you're one of my heroes. So thank you. You know, we're covering a series today called Why Jesus? And one of the questions about why Jesus is the question of who is Jesus Christ? Now, I'm going to tell you by my natural temperament, the kind of person who I am, one of the things that I can tell you is I'm just by natural temperament, I just don't trust people. I've always been a skeptic. I've always been a cynic. When someone tells me something, I'm always thinking, what do you want from me? I don't trust you. I'm just hard at trusting people. Probably don't trust some of you right now. What do you want from me? You know? And so one of the things that I get told is, you're a Christian because you grew up in a Christian home. And I'm like, that's not why I'm a Christian. You know? Because I was that kind of kid where my parents would tell me something and I'm thinking, what do you want from me? And why are you telling me this? I never believed something just because someone told me something. Yes, I was influenced by my parents, and I thank God for them, and it's influenced by my church family, and I thank God for them. But it came really down to it was, why do I believe what I believe, and is Jesus really who he claims to be? That really is the essential question. You know, faith is really based on the deity and the person of Jesus Christ. If what Jesus says about himself is true, then really I should do what he says. But if he really isn't, then he's a big fat liar and I shouldn't listen to him. Essentially, that's how I think. And so I got asked this question, and I thought to myself as I was growing up, who is Jesus Christ? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Who is Jesus? And I remember a few years ago, I was at this coffee shop bookstore. That's what we do in the Northwest. And I kept hearing all these people talk about Jesus, and there are things that I'm like, where did you get that? I've never even heard some of that stuff. And so I decided to walk around the bookstore, and I went to the magazine rack, and I saw Time magazine and National Geographic, and then all these different books in the religious section had all these things about Jesus, and I'm like, where did they get some of this information? and I had to ask myself, who is Jesus really? And I thought to myself, have you ever seen those news shows where the news reporter goes up to people and they'll show them pictures of like former presidents and of famous people and ask, do you know who this person is? And they're like, I don't know. You show them like Abraham Lincoln and then they're like, is that Justin Bieber? And you know, that's just, they just don't know. And so when you ask people, who is Jesus? Sometimes people are like, I don't know. But here's some of the common responses. Some will say he's the Son of God. He's merely a moral teacher, a charismatic Jewish carpenter, a significant historical figure, a make-believe fairy tale. And these are some of the most common things said about Jesus. And so one of the things I asked myself is, who is Jesus really? If I did an in-depth study and just interviewed people, what would I really come up with? Who would I come to know who Jesus truly is? And would I come away with the understanding that he is the Son of God, or just one of these other things, a teacher, a carpenter, a historical figure, or a make-believe fairy tale? You know, one of the things that people indict Christians on is the belief that we only believe in Jesus because we need an emotional crutch to get us through life. And I tell people, that's not what I follow Jesus. I don't need an emotional crutch. It's whether or not the fact is Jesus really the Son of God or not? That's one of the essential questions we really have to ask, because one of the things that we have to understand is if Jesus is who he claims to be, that determines how I'm going to live the rest of my life. And one of the things I often do is I try to do things from an objective standpoint. You know, the Bible even tells us in the book of Jeremiah, do not trust the heart because your heart is deceitful above all things. Your emotions can deceive you. So I want us to look at an objective standpoint of Jesus. I want us to see, is Jesus really the Son of God? And what would people say? And some people say, well, all you do is go to the New Testament. Well, the New Testament is a historical, reliable document, so if that's the only source we had, that would be good enough. But what if we asked some other people? Today what I want us to do is I want us to play the role of a news reporter. I want us to go and interview a few different people throughout history. And I want us to see what do they have to say about Jesus. And a lot of the people that we're going to be mentioning about today are going to be people who have no relationship to Jesus Christ and are not of the Christian faith. And what do they have to say about Jesus? I want you to be objective here. Because if at the end of this lesson you really see Jesus has to be the Son of God based on the evidence and not by pure hope, not by pure emotion, not by pure want, it really is a fact that Jesus is the Son of God, then it has to change our lives forever. Do we make him Lord? Do we submit our lives? Do we obey the gospel? Do we get baptized into his name? Are all these things that we have to answer based on this one question, who is Jesus? So let's look at some of the questions. You know, Bertrand Russell, he is a famous historical atheist. And in fact, he's known what we call an anti-theist. He's not just someone who is one who didn't believe in a God, but he is one who's militant against anyone who proclaims a supreme being. And in fact, he wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Christian. That's considered pretty much the Bible of the atheist movement. All the famous atheists always go back to this essay, Why I Am Not a Christian, by Bertrand Russell. And he made this comment, historically it is quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all, and if he did, we do not know anything about him. That sounds like a really good soundbite, doesn't it? I've heard a lot of secular people say that, and it sounds really convincing, and he's a very educated guy. We don't even know if Jesus existed. I'm not going to believe in him. We know hardly anything about him. Is that true? And the first thing that people will say is, Bertrand Russell's true because all you do is point to the New Testament. Let's say, okay, I believe it's historically reliable, but let's go outside of the Bible. Let's see what they have to say. First thing I want to do is examine what do historians have to say about Jesus. And mind you, the people who are going to be mentioned from this are going to be closer to the time of Jesus. They're known and documented by the secular academia as legitimate historians, and they weren't Christians. So we don't see bias here, okay? So let's see if Bertrand Russell is true. Tacitus, AD 68 through 96. All these names I'm putting up, you can Google them. Test this. But this is what he wrote. Tacitus is considered the greatest ancient Roman historian, and all academia says so. In his time frame, he was the best Roman historian. And this is what he wrote. But not all the relief that could come from man, not all the bounties that the prince could bestow, nor all the allotments which could be presented by the gods availed to relieve Nero from the infamy of being believed to have ordered the conflagration of the fire of Rome. Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius, by the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but also the city of Rome also. So the greatest Roman historian of his time makes known that there's Christians, they had a Christ, they named him by name, in the area of Judea, and who killed him? So right there, Bertrand Russell is proven wrong just by the man that academics call the greatest Roman historian. And this is in AD 68 through 96. This is shortly after the time of Jesus. But what about, and he was not a believer. What about this guy, Lucian? He was in 2nd century. He was a Grecian satire writer. And he wrote this. The Christians, worship a man this day, the distinguished personage who introduced novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see these misguided creatures, you see the bias against Christianity, start with general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them, and then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. Here's an outside source biased against Christianity, and look at how he defined Christianity. Are we going to live forever? Yes. Do we follow Jesus? Yes. Are we brothers? Yes. Do we not view the things of this world as important? This is in the 2nd century by a guy biased against Christianity. And he acknowledges the presence of Jesus Christ and of Christians. 2nd century. And you know what? This is important because most atheists will say, you know what? Jesus never claimed to be deity, but over a few centuries, people rewrote the New Testament to make him what he wasn't supposed to be, the Son of God. Here we have evidence that that simply wasn't true. Look at Pliny the Younger. This is AD 112. Now here we have people who would have lived in the time of people who have known Jesus. They may not have seen Jesus themselves, but they would have known people who saw Jesus. And Pliny the Younger was the governor of Bithynia, and he actually sent spies into a Christian worship to kind of spy out on them. He was not one who was for Christianity. But look, they say Christians took all these centuries to develop Jesus as God. Look, it only took a couple of generations, and this is proclaiming his deity. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day, what we're doing today, before it was light, when they sang in alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to God, and bound themselves to solemn oath, not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify the word, not to deny a trust when they should be called to deliver it up. So here we have in AD 112 that already Christ is being called God. Why? Because he is, and that's what was taught by the early church and was known in the 1st century. And so here's a guy spying out Christians, a governor of the Roman Empire. Now, Malabar Serapion, AD 70, shortly after the time of Jesus, he wrote this about Jesus. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished, referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jews ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion, nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching he had given. So right there, when the same generation of people who would have lived in the time of Christ, they're already talking about this Jesus, this king of the Jews. That's what he was referring to. So is Bertrand Russell correct so far by looking at mere secular evidence by non-Christian historians? Look at Thales in AD 52. Julius Africanus, who existed in AD 221, recorded what Thales wrote in AD 52. It says this: Thales, in the third book of his histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun unreasonably, as it seems to me. Unreasonably, of course, because the solar eclipse could not take place at the time of the full moon, and it was at the season of the paschal full moon that Christ died. So here are some historians advocating the fact that the day darkened, the sun darkened. And what happened at the cross? It darkened. And it was not during a solar time where an eclipse was possible. But what's our explanation? What does the New Testament give? It's the fact that they were killing the Son of God. Julian the Apostate, this one I really think is funny. Julian the Apostate gets that name because he was so militant against Christianity. He was an anti-theist. He was a Roman emperor and he hated Christians. But look at what he says. Jesus, having persuaded a few among you, Galileans, as the contemptuously called the Christians, and those of the worst of men, has now been celebrated about 300 years, having done nothing in his lifetime worthy of fame, unless anyone thinks it is a very great work to heal the lame and blind people and exorcise demons in the villages of Bethsaida and Bethany. Yeah, he didn't do anything great. He just healed people, cast out demons. Low standards, Jesus. You know, I just think about that, and here he's thinking that's an insignificant life. But he, even a militant emperor against Christianity, said, you know, for the last 300 years, they've been worshiping Jesus as God. And this is a guy who doesn't believe in Jesus. He hates Christians. And he even lists where Jesus was doing it, Bethsaida and Bethany. These are things that we know. And here, he's only a few hundred years removed. But he acknowledges the fact. He has a knowledge of saying, you know, for the last few hundred years, people have been worshiping Jesus as God. And he was militant against Christianity. Bertrand Russell doesn't know what he's talking about. And Josephus, AD 37 to 100, he was a Jewish historian and politician, and he wasn't a Christian, but he wrote this. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it would be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, referring to his miracles, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets have foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Look at that. So one of the things is, we see that even this Jewish historian who wasn't a Christian acknowledged Jesus did miracles, created a movement, and was killed by Pilate, and he was the Christ, rose on the third day. That's not even this isn't even Bible. This is historical fact. And so a lot of the people say, you Christians are so biased because all you depend on is the New Testament, and say, that's all we really need. But if you want more and you want us to show our non-bias, we've got the evidence right here. Time of Jesus, AD 37 to 100. That's an amazing thing. And one of the things is no historian ever denies the existence of Pilate. But when it came to contemporary information about Pilate in the time that he lived, the only time Pilate's mentioned in documents of antiquity in those early centuries were only really related when Jesus Christ was also mentioned. So if you had no problem believing that Pilate was real, based on the secular evidence, then you should have no problem that Jesus was real and did the things he did as well, because he's mentioned in those same documents that Pilate was. And so here, what do the historians rule so far? Did Jesus exist? Did Jesus do miracles? Was he worshipped as God even on the early time and not centuries later, like atheists like to claim? If you base it on objective evidence, this is what it shows. But let's get past that. What about other religions? What do they say about Jesus? Have you ever questioned, what do they think about Jesus? you're going to get a kind of interesting perspective. Islam, the fastest growing religion in the Western world, they say these things about Jesus. And this is all from the Quran, the writings. They believe he was a prophet. They believe in the virgin birth. They believe he performed miracles. They believe he had a gospel. But the major things that we obviously don't have is, they have a Quran, we have the Bible. They don't believe he is the Son of God, but we do. And they don't believe in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We do. And they don't believe he was crucified. So we obviously see that we're not the same with Islam, and they obviously have a lot of teachings that don't coincide Scripture. But one of the things that they do acknowledge is they acknowledge Jesus is a prophet. And according to the Muslim faith, you have to believe all the prophets that Muhammad claimed were prophets, otherwise you're not saved. So they actually say you have to believe Jesus was a prophet of God in order to be saved by the Muslim faith. Isn't it interesting that even they have a positive view of Jesus to a certain extent? Not necessarily the complete accurate view of Jesus, but somewhat valuable. What about Hindu? Shanaka Rishi Das, director of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies at Oxford University in the United Kingdom, says this about Jesus. He believes Jesus to be an avatar, a supreme being. He believes Jesus to be an acharya, a religious leader by example and instruction. And one of the things that Hinduism really teaches is forgiveness is the principal quality of a civilized man. And why Hindus love Jesus so much was because Jesus was the epitome of forgiveness. And he taught lessons on forgiveness that were so incredibly difficult, including ones that if someone wrongs you, you must forgive them at all times, and you will be forgiven as you forgive others. And so even Hindus, to a certain degree, even though their view on Jesus isn't completely accurate, they even have a somewhat positive view of Jesus. But what about Buddhism? Tenzin Gyatso, the current Dalai Lama of the Tibetan Buddhism, wrote this about Jesus. In my readings in the New Testament, I find myself inspired by Jesus' acts of compassion. His miracle of the loaves and his fishes, and his healing and his teaching are all motivated by the desire to relieve suffering. So here we have the supreme ruler of the Tibetan Buddhist faith saying that he believes that Jesus performed miracles and that Jesus was a moral leader. So that's kind of interesting. And we're going to see why this is a little bit significant in a little bit. And then Judaism. Rabbi Baruch Leff made these claims about Judaism's view of Jesus. Jesus is not the Son of God, not born of a virgin mother, was not promised the Messiah the prophet spoke about, was merely a historical figure who spoke in rabbinical tradition and was just very charismatic, but the promised Messiah is still to come. And so they probably had one of the harsher views against Jesus. And obviously we understand why, because it would go against their theology and their nationalistic view of the coming Messiah. But isn't it interesting that some of these major religions had a positive view to a degree about Jesus? Now why is that? But what about this? What do atheists say about Jesus? This one's going to be interesting. Out of all the famous atheists today, the most famous atheist today is a man by the name of Richard Dawkins. He is a doctor and a professor at Oxford University. He wrote the bestseller, The God Delusion, which was not only an atheistic book, it was an anti-theist book, really discrediting the scriptures and the character of God. But what does he say about Jesus? It's going to be kind of interesting to see what the greatest, most prominent, most well-known atheist had to say about Jesus. He says, of course Jesus was a theist, but that is the least interesting thing about him. He was a theist because in his time, everybody was. Atheism was not an option, even for so a radical thinker as Jesus. What was interesting and remarkable about Jesus was not the obvious fact that he believed in the God of his Jewish religion, but that he rebelled against many aspects of Yahweh's vengeful nastiness. At least in the teachings that are attributed to him, he publicly advocated niceness and was one of the first to do so. to those steeped in the Sharia-like cruelties of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, to those brought up to fear the vindictive Ayatollah-like God of Abraham and Isaac. A charismatic young preacher who advocated generous forgiveness must have seemed radical to the point of subversion. No wonder they nailed him. No wonder they nailed him. What is interesting here is, does Richard Dawkins believe Jesus is a true historical figure? He does. Does he believe that Jesus was crucified on a cross? He does. But one of the things is he hates God, and it's obvious. You can tell he hates God. But one of the things is he doesn't discredit the fact that Jesus was a charismatic quality preacher who taught a lot of good moral teachings. That's one of the main things that atheists like Richard Dawkins will say. Jesus was a moral teacher. But do you know what's interesting about them making them claim saying that Jesus is a moral teacher but not the Son of God? I asked them the question, how do you know that Jesus was a moral teacher? Where do you get that information that Jesus was a moral teacher? Where do you get his teachings? From the New Testament. And so when you say Jesus is a moral teacher who was a moral man, well, we read a whole bunch of things about Jesus, but it really didn't give detail about his character and his teachings. Not too in-depth. Where do we get that? The New Testament. So when they say Jesus is a moral leader and a moral teacher and a moral man, it's like, where do you get that information? They got it from the New Testament. So to a degree, even atheists lend credibility to the New Testament, and they have to if they're objective in the fact that the Bible passes all the tests for historical reliability. The interesting thing is, no one questions whether or not Julius Caesar existed or the conquest that he had performed, but there's a lot more evidence of Jesus dying and rising on the third day than anything that Julius Caesar ever done. Yeah, we don't doubt Julius Caesar, and he's in our history books. Everyone calls Jesus this moral leader, but where do they have to get that information? From the New Testament. So if they're even lending credibility to the New Testament, I think it's fair to say we deserve to go to the New Testament as well. What did the New Testament writers say about Jesus? What did they say? Who did they claim him to be? The Apostle Peter wrote this, and this is in Matthew 16. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So who did Peter, who saw Jesus and heard Jesus and witnessed Jesus, who did he believe Jesus to be? The Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, when he said that, what would any righteous Jew, what would Jesus, if he was righteous in his Jewish faith, what would he have said if it wasn't true, what Peter just said? Blasphemy. Don't say that. Stone him. But Jesus doesn't. And in fact, he agrees by saying, this was given to you by my Father. I am the Son of God. The Apostle John begins his gospel by writing this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John chapter 1, verse 1. So who did the Apostle John believe Jesus to be? God. What about John the Baptist? In John chapter 1, verse 29. The next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. You know, John was the forerunner of the Messiah. And he who knew who Jesus was. And the only one who could take away sin of the world is God himself. And so he was acknowledging Christ's deity. The Apostle Thomas, he gets a lot of bad rap for being called Doubting Thomas. He was a skeptic and cynic like I was. He was like, prove it to me. But when Jesus appeared to him and showed him the scars on his hands and feet, this was Thomas's response. And like Peter's response, it would have been blasphemous if it was wrong. But Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. So who did Thomas say he was? The Apostle Paul wrote this in Philippians 2, chapter 5 through 7. It says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. You know, Paul uses the word, the form of God. Form comes from the Greek word morphe, which means the form, the character, and the nature. So he's saying, Jesus is God. So who did Paul, this guy who was the number one public enemy against Christianity, what did he later change his mind on this Jesus? That he is God. And what about God himself? What does God say? This was mentioned at Jesus' baptism. And it says, and behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. So God himself is witnessing and testifying, Jesus is my Son. Now some people will say Jesus never claimed to be deity. They made him out to be. Yeah, his disciples believed him to be deity. But that's because they wanted to believe that. Well, did Jesus actually say so? He does. In John chapter 8, verse 58 through 59, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Obviously, that statement made the Jews really angry to the point where they wanted to stone him. Why? Because Jesus just made a statement that would be considered blasphemy if it wasn't true. You know, the name I am actually originates in Exodus, the 3rd chapter, when Moses is called by God to deliver his people from bondage of Egypt. And so Moses is asking God, what name do I give your people so they know I am from you? And do you remember what God says? He says, my name is I am. And so when Jesus is saying, you know, before Abraham, before the father of faith, before this guy you consider this foundational part of your faith, I'm even greater than he. Because I came before him. And not only did I come before him, I am. I am God. So did Jesus believe he was God? Yes. Did his disciples, which all the apostles, except for maybe the apostle John, were killed and martyred for their faith, they wouldn't have died for something they would have known to be a lie. They had to have believed it. And historians confirm the fact that Jesus did die, and that he even raised on the 3rd day, like Josephus says. And they weren't even Christian people. Even other religions think well of Jesus. Even atheists give credit to Jesus as a moral leader, as living. So look at all this evidence. If we took an objective standpoint, if we took out all the emotion and just thought, is Jesus truly the Son of God, based on all this information, based on all this evidence, do I conclude that he is the Son of God or that he isn't the Son of God? And if he is the Son of God, how does that affect the rest of my life? Will I make him the Lord of my life? Will I change the way that I live? Will I seek relationship with him? Will I treat my neighbor differently? You know, a lot of people are asking themselves these questions. And if Jesus is who he's claiming to be, and if you're here today and you've been thinking about this Jesus, and you've been thinking about getting baptized into Christ because he commands you to, and you're asking yourself, is Jesus really who he claims to be? And if he is, and I need to obey him, and I want to live for him because he loved me enough to die on the cross to save me from my sins, then why don't I make those changes today? Why don't I make that choice today? If Jesus is who he claimed to be, and all the evidence points it out, and Bertrand Russell is absolutely wrong, and truth is, Jesus is the Son of God, then what's stopping you today? What's stopping you from being baptized into Christ? What's stopping you from changing to being the person God has called you to be? Jesus is the Son of God. Our faith is not just a mere emotion. It's not a mere crutch. It's not a mere hope. It's fact. It's truth. And it's the truth that we want to live on today. So if today you want us to pray for you so that you can change to be more like the Son of God, or if today you want to commit your life in baptism and be saved by him as he has called us to, we give you that invitation now as we stand and sing.